Welcome back to the MeidasTouch Podcast. We are joined by no other than Page Pate, who has taken the MeidasTouch Challenge to talk about SB 202. Page Pate is the managing partner at Pate, Johnson and Church, which has offices in Atlanta and Los Angeles, I found out recently, in Washington, D.C., close by to me. He is a legal analyst for 11 Alive in Atlanta, and most significantly, did a hit where he talked about SB 202, where MeidasTouch was mentioned.
We've gotten questions about the new election law every day, and there are all kinds of claims swirling around the internet. This time, we're going to focus on this one, a tweet from an account called MeidasTouch, claiming the new law gives officials the power to overturn elections if they do not like the result.
So there's certainly the potential for some concern and abuse of this law. But as far as allowing the state board to change the results, that's not what it does.
So we can verify the claim that this new election law gives officials the power to overturn election results is false.
I think that's the most important thing, Paige, to mention here. But of your incredible career and all the awards that you won was the hit that you did the other day. But thank you so much for joining the MeidasTouch Podcast.
Absolutely. Happy to be with you guys.
And so we were going at you a little bit on Twitter. And look, I think possibly it wasn't your fault so much as 11 Alive's fault and how they framed the tweet as being a false tweet that we sent versus I think what the intent that you wanted to say. But I wanted to set the record straight because I think there is truth to our tweet. And I think there may be truth to what you were saying. And I think that sometimes one of the problems that we have is sometimes in these 2-minute hits, the way that the media has to frame the issue, they really can't go into the nuance and have the in-depth discussion of the problems. And so I want to just spend a little time today, not take up too much of your time, as I know you're a practicing attorney. The tweet in question was a MeidasTouch tweet that said, quote, "The new Georgia voter suppression law gives officials the power to overturn elections if they do not like the results. This is dangerous and we cannot let this stand." That was a MeidasTouch tweet, which resulted in the 11 Alive piece, which then did an interview with you, which we'll play before this interview. And what we're referring to was Section 5 of the SB 202 bill, which basically removed the power of the Secretary of State from as being the chair of the state election board and appointing somebody from the General Assembly. It also gave the board the power to remove the superintendent or the election supervisors from certain counties if this new board found that the supervisor or superintendent was acting negligent or irresponsible over the course of 2 election cycles there. Without going much further than that, do I have the facts right there so far? Are we in agreement in those facts? That's what it does.
Yeah, I think mostly, I mean, like you said at the beginning, this is a very complicated law, and I think intentionally so. I think the Republican General Assembly buried a lot of material in this 98-page bill. So it's really hard to try to just gloss over it. But I think you've got the basics right. I mean, there are very specific findings that the election board has to make before they remove a superintendent from a municipality or a county. But yes, they can do that. That's correct.
And a superintendent or an election supervisor, it's called different things in different states. But at a very local level, elections are very local, right? And the superintendents do have a lot of power, right? And they have power, for example, to look at absentee votes. They have the power to look at signatures. If we think back to the 2000 Florida elections, sometimes making the decisions, right? We all have that PTSD of the hanging Chad or not the hanging Chad. And do I count this one or that
Chads,
one?
I was 10 years old and I have the PTSD of the hanging Chad.
But they are empowered though, right, Paige, to make certain decisions. Granted, those decisions could be subject to later reviews and challenges and court cases, but they're kind of that first line that are making a lot of these important decisions if there are valid or non-valid votes. Is that accurate?
You're right about that. Georgia law sets forth very specific powers and duties of those superintendents. They get to instruct and hire poll workers. They get to pick the machines, decide where the poll locations are going to be. And I guess most important for our discussion, at the end of the process, they are that first line of certification. They have to certify the results from their particular jurisdiction and then send it into the Secretary of State's office.
And of course, we all know from the past election, I guess there was different views that the Trump supporters won. Some of them were keep counting, and some were stop the vote, and some were keep counting. But one of the key issues here was going to be that first line of defense as to certification would be this superintendent. And here the question then becomes, well, who is the General Assembly looking at here? What are the counties that they truly view as problematic? And, we had the ability to ask the question to Gabriel Sterling. We said, so the bill mentions that, certain counties are problematic. Do any counties specifically meet this definition right now? And without missing a beat, though, to his credit, whether it was a moment of honesty or a moment of letting his guard down, he goes, Fulton County, right away. And so do you believe that? Do you believe that this is aimed, though, pretty much specifically at the Republican legislature to try to take control over the superintendent of Fulton County?
I do think Fulton County has gotten a lot of attention, and I think probably deservedly so, for problems in running elections. I mean, that's where we saw the really long lines, both in the primaries and in the general election. But I think the problem with Fulton County was not so much in the certification process, but how they conducted the election itself. And I do think Gabe Sterling is correct about that. Still, though, if they're going to remove somebody from Fulton County, the superintendent, they've got to go through the process that they put forth in this bill, which is now law in Georgia.
Right. And that process, though, and what those standards are would eventually, though, at some point that goes in front of a Georgia state court judge?
If it's challenged, yes. I mean, in the law itself, the board basically determines whether or not there's been a violation and whether or not they have authority to replace the superintendent. And I think I said in my interview, and I'm not entirely sure if it made the cut for the short hit, but there is obviously the potential for abuse of this law because now the state elections board is basically going to be controlled by Republicans. If you take the Secretary of State off and he's still on the board, but he's a non-voting member. So he doesn't count anymore for purposes of the board. You've got the state Senate appointing one member, the state House appointing one member, and then each party appoints a member. So right now, our Senate and House are controlled by Republicans. So Republicans would appoint 3 members of this 5-person board. So they could control the vote. And that's the potential for concern. But again, the process is baked into the law itself, such that there's a lot of opportunities to challenge that decision. Findings of fact have to be made. And yes, you're right. Ultimately, if a superintendent wants to challenge the board decision, they can take it to court.
And then when Gabriel Sterling was on, we gave the example of there are 4 of us that are on here right now. If we were to have a vote, who's right? The brothers would vote for me, and I would win. We can say we're going through a process, right, and we can make fact findings, and we can do all of those things. But at the end of the day, if the underlying intent behind this law is that the Republicans were wronged in this past election, and you have the Republicans then controlling this board, it would be hard for me to believe that the fact-finding process would not reach the conclusion that the Republican view of things is right. Granted, you can challenge it. Granted, it sets these standards. But to me, at the end of the day, the very system of the board is going to be rigged in favor of the Republican view here.
I think that's certainly possible. Although, again, even assuming you put aside that I've got to find 3 violations of the law and go to that second element, all I have to do is show gross negligence. But I've still got to show that in the last 2 elections. So as the board, I can't just step in and say, hey, superintendent, we don't like what you did in this election, so you're gone. I have to show evidence that this is a pattern of misconduct before I can try to remove the superintendent.
And I think that if you asked Gabriel Sterling, he would say that pattern is already there in certain counties, which tend to be Democratic counties. But Paige, isn't the mere possibility of abuse that's built into a law, and that possibility of abuse resulting in manipulations of elections in favor of Republicans, isn't just that very nature problematic?
It's problematic. And I've not been a fan of this law for a variety of reasons. And I think most of the legal challenges have focused on other parts of the law that I don't know if we're going to discuss today. But Section 5 itself, to me, and also to the lawyers that have filed these federal lawsuits, is not the focus or is not the worst part of this law. Because let's assume that, yeah, the board acts irrationally, they're politically motivated, and they remove the superintendent. Well, you put another superintendent in, and all that person can do is go through the process of, checking the poll workers, issuing guidance, and certifying or not certifying the results from that particular jurisdiction. And so I guess when 11 Alive, read me the tweet, and again, I did not see it before, had not heard of you guys, did not know anything about how that question was generated. My problem with it was that the state elections board could remove a superintendent simply because they didn't like the results in that particular jurisdiction. And I don't think the law allows them to do that.
And I think you only have a certain amount of characters in the tweet, but I think what the tweet is saying is a worst case scenario about how this law can be abused. And I think that we wouldn't want that to take place. And we hope that the legislatures operate in good faith. But there is a scenario where this is abused. The superintendent does not certify the results. And when you have somebody like Donald Trump reaching out and having phone calls the way he was trying to have phone calls with Gabriel Sterling. I mean, Gabriel Sterling didn't take that phone call and certified the results, right? The Secretary of State Raffensperger took the phone call, but Trump was trying to get at the General Assemblies. That was his whole plan, to do end run around it. So aren't we a little afraid that Trump's going to call his General Assembly buddy? I mean, hopefully Trump never runs again, but that's the fear that we have, is he was trying to make those phone calls to the General Assembly, and now they've appointed somebody who may pick up the phone call. And when Trump goes, don't certify the results, they go, yeah, I'm not going to certify it. And then we have a true constitutional crisis.
Well, I mean, you're certainly right. That could present a constitutional crisis. But in a situation where you're certifying elections from the state for purposes of the Electoral College, that's more of a discretionary act than what these local superintendents are doing in the run-of-the-mill, midterm general. There's an election going on in Georgia right now for certain local judges. And to certify those results, it really is more of a ministerial act. It's not, I'm going to decide which slate of electors we're going to send to D.C. It's, what are the numbers here? Either they're showing up the way I think they should or they're not. I can refuse to certify them, but I can't change the results. I can't certify some other slate of votes because I like that result better.
Well, I'll give you an example. So the Vice President Pence's role in certifying the elections was an administerial role. I mean, and everyone was like, it's just counting. But right. Donald Trump and a group of Republicans, including probably a ton of people in the General Assembly who passed this bill, thought that there was some way for the vice president to not do that ministerial act and to basically change it. So if you passed the law that changed it and said, what, the vice president doesn't do it, it's somebody who Donald Trump and a board of people who he appoints gets to basically do that ministerial act. And then we're supposed to all believe, what, they're just going to follow the typical ministerial advice like they're supposed to. That's, I think, the alarm that we have in this bill. That the intent behind it is to change the process because Raffensperger and Sterling held the line. Vice President Pence held the line. We thought all of these things were ministerial. And now they're trying to create ways to, sure, it may still be ministerial, but there are other ways maybe to get around that now through a very opaque omnibus bill.
Well, yes, but that problem was present before this law was passed, as you just pointed out. I mean, somebody who's bent on violating the law like Trump was can still call the governor and say, I don't want you to send in this slate of electors. He can try to manipulate the General Assembly. And that was true before this law was passed. I don't know.
Totally, but we shouldn't make it easier, though.
Well, that's true. Absolutely. And again, I'm a fan of this law. Not at all am I a fan of this law. But you mentioned Gabe Sterling. Did you see his piece in the Washington Post?
No, I go directly to the source. I speak to them directly.
It should, absolutely. But recently, and I think it was just published yesterday, he was critical of the law, but also critical, I think, of the way that the Biden administration has kind of spun the law a little bit more than perhaps what the actual text says. So it's a bad law, but I don't know it's as bad as some people are saying.
And here's the thing, though, when I talk to Gabe Sterling, and to that point that it's not as bad as people said, the very essence of the law is built on a fraudulent finding. You agree with that?
100%, yes.
And so as just a lawyer and a lawmaker, from all perspectives, when you see that the law is based on fraud, how does anything that flows from it have literally any credibility? Like, how does Gabe even get the right to say, yeah, Biden's being an alarmist on a bill that was established based on fraud?
Right. No, you're right. And if you read the bill, the very first part makes all of these findings that are completely false about problems with the election, about fraudulent misconduct, about lack of confidence in the results. So yes, I think we start out with a bad premise. But the law does a few good things. It does allow Sunday voting in some counties in Georgia that never had it. It mandates that now. It now puts into law the fact that drop boxes can be used. That was a temporary rule by the Secretary of State. Now it's law. It's more difficult than it was before, but at least it's part of the law. So,
but shouldn't legislatures, though, want to? Like, that shouldn't be a controversial concept, though, that they're a Dropbox. Like, we shouldn't applaud them for doing the thing that they should have done. And then all they did was they did the thing they should have done anyway, but then limited it significantly and took it from outside to inside, limited the hours that you can use it. And then they want to basically a pat on the back to say, look, we now made it a law, but we actually severely limited it. For example, I think the drop boxes in Fulton County would like 70 to 80% less drop boxes in Fulton County as a result of this law, which is very problematic considering, I mean, that's clearly who they're targeting, right? Why would you want to have a 70 to 80% reduction in drop boxes in the Black County and then not and say this isn't a racist bill?
Right. And they also took away mobile voting, which was only being used by Fulton County, at least recently. The absentee ballot requirements are now a lot more difficult. And I think that's going to be the focus of the litigation going forward. And to the extent, the best legal argument, I think, is that they went way too far in restricting the ability to get an absentee ballot and to send in that absentee ballot. So you may see a successful legal challenge to that part of the law.
And then on the Sunday voting issue, which Gabe Sterling points to, in the Black areas, the souls to the polls, weekend, voting initiatives, that was really going on Saturday and Sunday, anyway, as far as I know, and that the areas that were open to Sunday or that mandated Sunday voting aren't really areas where there was a lot of Sunday voting to begin with. And what this bill really does is truncate the times in which you can actually vote on the Sunday so that it actually makes it a little bit harder for people who are working or who have that time off to actually go and vote on the weekend.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see a lot more people have to go vote in person because of these ID requirements now on absentee ballots. You can't send out an unsolicited application for an absentee ballot. So it's going to lead to more in-person voting. And that, of course, is going to be restricted by some other parts of the law. That's right.
But overall, Paige, you think it's a problematic bill. You're not, just for all the listeners out there, you're not for this bill. You think you're very against this bill, and you see all of the issues that are there, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And the one thing we didn't talk about, which has gotten a lot of lawyers here in Georgia upset about, is the idea that people can be criminally prosecuted for giving folks some water while they stand in line outside in the heat waiting to get in and vote. And that's just absurd. I think anyone would see that.
And that's, when you ask Gabriel Sterling, he goes, well, people were trying to electioneer or convince people to vote. But Paige, you're a criminal lawyer. There was already a law that prohibits that. So if that was the case, you would have seen people arrested for that. So there's already a law on the books that does that. And this is purely intended to harass and intimidate people and make it more difficult to wait on long lines, particularly in Black areas.
You're absolutely right. And there was a law and still is a law that punishes criminally anyone who tries to campaign when there's a line going into the poll.
Right. That's Georgia code. I memorized this 21-2414. Am I right?
I believe so. I haven't memorized the code section. So
I have it in front of me. Paige, any final closing words about the bill, about your practice? Any comments you want to make to future young lawyers out there about your experience at MeidasTouch, how much fun you've had over the past 22 minutes? I'll leave you with the last few minutes.
Now, look, I appreciate what you guys are doing. I did obviously look into the group after I received the various tweets from the fan club that you have across the Twitter universe. And you're obviously well respected. There would have been no reason for 11 Alive to respond to you guys if you didn't have a wide audience, which you clearly do. Keep the attention on Georgia. I mean, we've been in the spotlight for quite some time with our Senate election, the close presidential election. The state is changing, and I think it's changing in a way that is going to benefit most people of the state in a way that we have not seen in many, many years. So, don't lose sight of what's happening here. There's some major changes going on, and we look forward maybe to talking to you again in the future.
Page Pate, thank you for joining the MeidasTouch Podcast. Have a great rest of the week.
Same to you guys.